Here we are. Let's see if this is actually working. Um, the preview that I'm being shown is really, really off. So we'll wait to see if anyone shows up. This is my snake Aphrodite, and she's a ball python. So I'm hoping the lag is not as bad in reality as it seems to me. But, we'll see. Hard to tell. There's going to be noise from upstairs and stuff for my family. So, yeah. Sorry about that. Um, so, yeah. Until I see someone in the chat, I'm just going to start, with talking about Aphrodite, actually, just for a minute. She's a ball python, relatively young one. She was born back in last year, not too far in last year. So yeah, she's I don't know, 4 or 5 months old at this point, I think. So she's pretty cool, and it's been very interesting actually with my kids watching them. Uh, no, close the thing. Welcome chat. Remember to guard your privacy. Interesting. It's been very interesting seeing the kids. They really like her quite a lot. For those who don't know, by the way, ball pythons are constrictors. They're non-venomous and only dangerous to you if you are pretty much a rodent smaller than them, significantly smaller than them, actually. Because the interesting thing is they only constrict with about that much of their body, and so this portion is the stuff like lungs and stomach and back or intestines. And so you have to sort of fit inside of about that portion roughly. Hi, 80K Bladesmith. Nothing yet. I'm just talking about my pet snake. Rather fond of snakes. They're rather beautiful creatures. Anyway, so I was figuring I'd open things up to Hi, Scotum Fidelis. So, if anyone had questions, subjects they wanted to talk about, and so on, I figured to open it up and say hello. Had a interesting live chat the other day with Rob from Deflating Atheism, and that was pretty cool. So I thought, what the heck, I'll give it a try. Just doing this and responding. So, yeah, actually, a somewhat interesting topic is some people are afraid of snakes, from what I gather, and I don't know why. It's one of those things I've always been kind of curious about. And there are different theories as to why people are, and of course it's obvious with venomous snakes, but not so much with constrictors, who are really remarkably harmless and less dangerous than typical pets like dogs, for example. But it's possible that it's just a lack of knowledge about the distinction between venomous and non-venomous. So just a reminder to everyone in the comments. If you have any questions or comments or stuff, please ask. And to answer the question, how am I doing? Doing well. Considering the circumstances, doing very well. Thank God. And actually, I have. I'm a programmer. I work from home, so just on the practical side of things, life is surprisingly not very different for me. The kids are home all the time, but that's actually going really well. They don't have school, and so yeah, thank you. And we're all doing well. I hope you guys are doing well. So it's one thing that's been something of an adjustment has been the whole the whole thing of public masses being canceled, and it's just been weird not showing up to mass. Scoon Fidelis asked, "Is it true that you can tell a venomous snake by its pupils?" And the answer is not really. The thing about pupils on a snake is more about whether they're nocturnal or diurnal. More nocturnal species tend to have the more vertical slit because they need to be able to open their eyes really, really wide, is I believe the reason. There really isn't a reliable way to tell venomous from non-venomous. Venomous tend to have somewhat larger heads, so there is that. They also tend not to have particularly big bodies, but then you'll find like lots of colubrids that are not venomous in the least and also have relatively thin bodies. So you more kind of need to know the particular ones. In general, the way life tends to work is if there are any species of venomous snakes in one's area, you'll just be taught that as you grow up and told about it to avoid them. And other than that, if you run across somebody keeping a snake, like there's a 99.99% chance it is not in fact venomous. I mean, there are people who keep venomous snakes, but it's actually really, really rare. So, not for me, to be sure. So, but yeah, just speaking of mass, it's definitely been interesting, um, like getting used to the whole not going to mass thing. Um, so if just it's not a replacement, but like with my boys, I've been just doing a bunch of extra reading of scripture and praying together on Sunday. In addition to the normal praying that we do. I don't know if any of you guys have checked out I mean, for those who are Catholic, mass being broadcast or things like that. I actually caught Bishop Barron's video of saying mass on Sunday. It was really nice. Actually, very comforting seeing that and some of the familiar stuff. So, yeah. So, what have you guys been up to on YouTube? I know I haven't been putting out the most videos. That's definitely been something I've been working on getting back into, is getting my video production back up, and of course things are now so crazy busy. It's hard to follow through on that. As I had mentioned in a previous video, it had a number of technical problems that I worked through and now have a pretty decent setup, and now just being really, really busy and so on, it's really hard to get anything done that way. But also just for the time, the preparedness, because as much as my unscripted videos may seem kind of long and rambly, there is some preparation that goes into them, and some I'll not quite rehearse, but something to that effect. And yeah, even that's been a little bit crazy of late. Just generally preparing things, doing some stuff, practical stuff like cleaning the pantry and making sure it's in good shape, and just having a little bit of extra stock on some stuff. And so that's been interesting. But yeah, has anything been interesting? I haven't been watching very much YouTube lately, also just because of lack of time. So for those in the comments, anything interesting been happening on YouTube? And while I wait for you guys to answer, yeah, that's one thing. I don't have a sense of what the time delay is on these things. But anyway, the trying to think. Pretty much the YouTube's, it's been kind of interesting seeing things over time, and I mean, of course, one of the things that my channel does is talking about subjects that bring atheists out of the woodwork, and that seems to have been happening a lot less. Every now and then I'll get some sort of comment from somebody, but I'm getting a lot less of that. The people who will aggressively tell you that they simply lack a belief in stuff. So I haven't been over to the atheist side. I don't typically make videos about like atheist videos. Tend more towards just the subjects, and especially subjects that people bring to my attention. And even there, just haven't been seeing as much. So I know, like, I recently was asked about Occam's razor. I don't know if you guys saw my video on that, but I did. Technically, actually, my second video on it, because I noticed that a while ago, and I was most of the way through making it when I remembered essentially that I did make a video on Occam's razor previously. But that was more about noting that Occam's razor isn't really Occam's when you get down to it. That like you never really found Occam stating it as such, and you do find a reasonable statement of it in Thomas Aquinas. So like yeah, so that was my video on, or my first video on Occam's razor. Made a second one, but you know, in terms of general subject, or you know, kind of similar subjects, there is one I've been considering making. As there's well, someone's been asking me various questions on the idea of life being a simulation or a video game, and there's not a lot on it because to some degree, like I think to a great degree, you don't find many refutations of that because people don't really take it very seriously, which I find kind of. I mean, on the one hand, I think it's one of those things for somebody who is worried by it. It's kind of unfortunate that not many people take it seriously to refute it. On the other hand, I think it's just not many people actually are bothered by it. But I don't know if you guys have seen it, but there's actually sort of an interesting on a meta level with that, with the idea of life being a video game. There's a sort of interesting meta level aspect to that, where I think those sort of things become interesting because, I mean, roughly speaking, because it's taking experience and generalizing from it, and it's taking from experience and generalizing in a kind of particular way, where it's sort of extrapolating, and I think it works best for people who saw like older video games and then newer video games, and then they're sort of extrapolating, like, wow, like these things are getting so much better. And like one of the things that isn't taken into account in that is that that's all from the perspective of the person who is sitting there having the simulation sort of, you know, presented to them. It's not in any sense getting more realistic to the like NPCs within the video game. And now this is one thing, being a programmer, I kind of know how video games are actually implemented. And you don't, for example, implement a video game by having, you know, some sort of NPC thing where you then produce, you know, large numbers of polygons, which you then render and then use some sort of optical recognition from that NPC in order to like see what the thing sees. You don't do anything vaguely like that. Instead, what you actually do is all the NPC type characters all have, you know, just global knowledge, and then you just limit what it is they actually interact with. And so it's kind of a curious thing where it's taking a certain experience and generalizing it to the entirely wrong thing. But it does tie into something actually when I was talking with Rob, which kind of came up. And that is roughly that there's a strong tendency for atheists to have had either weak fathers or no fathers, fathers who died very young or abandoned them. They tend to, basically that sort of childhood trauma has a tendency to make them sort of grow up very quickly, but at the same time it tends to, by transitioning into that sort of more adult phase of life, it also tends to make them freeze much more in wherever they had been when they had to grow up so rapidly. And so the curious upshot of which is that they often have a great deal of trust issues, and as well, they have a tendency to do that sort of adolescent thing of overgeneralizing from their own experience. You know, it's described teenagers, you know everything, which is basically they tend to assume that their experience is sufficient in practice. And so that, if you look at what atheists tend to actually believe, like the run-of-the-mill atheists, I'm not talking like Nietzsche, but you know, the run-of-the-mill types, it generally boils down to some variation of their experience is sufficient to explain the world. And so it's really curious that roughly speaking, there is that association that there's. It was Rob pointed out that they're often sort of kind of adolescent in their attitude, and it actually really fits because modern atheism is roughly a derivative of materialism, which was the idea that material matter and its interactions were sufficient to explain the entire world. But that ceased to be true. That was obviously not true once things like fields and electrons and probability, and especially once you get to quantum mechanics. So it becomes pretty much impossible to define matter in any sort of coherent way to say it's only just matter, because obviously it's not just matter. There's energy fields and things like this. And so the immaterial is obviously true and obviously exists. And so materialism is kind of screwed, but that same basic attitude just persisted. And just with it became naturalism, but without any sort of coherent definition. And roughly speaking, if you were to work it out, it tends to wind up being something to the effect of a physics textbook plus whatever will be added to it is sufficient to explain the world, which is a nonsensical thing. No one actually offers that definition per se. It's just kind of what it amounts to. So anyway, I found that a very interesting point, and there's sort of a very interesting tie into those things. So, let me see, getting back to the comments, Dillahunty did a debate with Cosmic Skeptic on the morality of meat eating that Cameron Gilchrist didn't bother to watch. Yeah, I don't know, maybe he's in favor of eating only gumballs. And, oh, Dillahunty debated David Wood. Wow, Wood must have just ground him into powder. I mean, yeah, wow, that must have been something. Apparently Sam Harris took 5 grams of mushrooms and blindfolded himself. He may have met God. That is an interesting experiment to run. Let's see. What's your thought on people who use the word godless as an account name? Godless atheist, godless Iowan, and so on. Yeah, this actually came up slightly in my conversation with Rob the other day, and I mentioned this somewhere else too. In my limited experience of people who use the word godless, you can surprisingly often just use the word brainless instead and not seem to be wrong. So I'm sure there are exceptions to that. It's a curious thing. So I guess in theory, godless whatever is meant to be like reclaiming the word, that thing where you take an insult and use it with pride or something to that effect. It's a little bit of a strange choice, but there's so much of what Rob called the refrigerator magnet naming scheme, and I would call Mad Lib naming scheme, where you take some variant of like godless or atheist or skeptic and marry it to either a location or a profession or a hobby. I did actually once see a godless hiker on Twitter, and so the that Mad Lib style of naming, I've yet to see a godless atheist. There must be one somewhere. That would be a fun name for a channel. Oh yeah, the video of the live stream with Rob is up on his channel. If you go to Deflating Atheism, you will find that the video of that live stream with him and me to answer a comment. The godless thing, I don't know what it is with that. It's kind of odd, and it's not being used exactly in its original sense. It's I guess it's being used to mean primarily that it's an insult, and I think in practice it's just being used as a synonym because it's hard to come up with like atheist names, and in terms of brand recognition, you want people to immediately what you're about when they see your name, I suppose. I'm not in this for the for the long-term popular, for like having millions of followers or for ad money. I don't run ads on it, so I haven't really been thinking in terms of brand recognition, building up a following. But I suspect there's an element of that like just whatever atheist or atheist whatever is largely like most of the good ones are taken, and so in kind of an analogous way, to how at some point when a lot of the good .com domains were taken, you start seeing things like .biz domains, at least a little bit. It may just be a reaction to most of the good atheist and skeptic names are already taken, and so people came up with godless as a substitute. So I'm kind of guessing. Let's see. What's my favorite argument for God? Scootum Fidelis asked, what's your favorite argument for God? I like the moral argument the most. You know, that's an interesting question, and it really depends. I mean, in many ways, I think my favorite argument for God is the argument from contingency and necessity, because it actually tells you so much about the nature of God. So that just real briefly, that the argument from contingency and necessity, just as a sort of refresher, is roughly speaking that that there is something that is contingent. If nothing else, you can go the Descartes route and say this argument itself is contingent, clearly, because it's composed of multiple pieces that did not, don't necessarily appear together, and therefore, since this, the fact that there is this contingency, there must be, it's contingent on something and so on. You can't have an infinite regress or it wouldn't exist, and therefore it must be grounded upon something which is necessary. That is to say, something which is not contingent. And so that necessary thing is what all men call God. And I'm presenting this obviously just as a refresher, not as a full thing for someone who's completely unfamiliar with it. But the interesting thing is sort of the next step. Once you go from that God is necessary, a lot of things actually become, you learn a bunch about God. Like, for example, that God is simple, that God is not composed of parts. Because if God were composed of parts, he wouldn't be necessary, because there would have to be some reason for those parts to be together. And since they are capable of independent existence, because they're capable of independent existence, there would have to be some reason for them to be apart. So therefore, God is not composed of parts capable of independent existence from each other, in the same way that, like, my left hand could exist without my right hand, and vice versa. I'm composed of parts that are capable of existing independently of each other. Take it down, billions of cells, trillions of cells, rather, and so on. And so, God is simple, and then it follows from that God lacks nothing, since God is simple and God is necessary. And so it follows that God is happy. God is perfectly happy and not dependent in his happiness on anything, because God does not lack anything. And it follows from there that the reason why God created the world is out of love. That is, he created the world as a gift. He created the world for the sake of the world, because he can't create the world for his own sake. God doesn't need anything. He doesn't lack anything. The world plus God is no greater than God. And so, and you can keep going, but this is why that's my favorite argument for the existence of God, because it tells you so much about the nature of God. That's not to say it's my favorite argument in the sense of helping somebody to come to see that God exists and is that the world is created by God. It's not the easiest argument to follow. It's very simple in one sense. It's got very few steps, but on the other hand, it's not. It's very abstract, and you have to grasp the steps pretty much directly. If you don't grasp the steps in the argument, it is extremely hard for anyone to help you grasp them. And so, for that reason, it's not my favorite argument if you're talking about what helps people more. I actually think, although I haven't presented it to many people, so I think, though, that probably the most the most generally accessible argument for the existence of God would actually be, if you look, it's the fifth argument St. Thomas presents, which is the argument from the governance of the world. And that is, the argument from the governance of the world is that the world is clearly governed according to a rational order, and therefore there must be somebody governing it. Now, there's several different ways of taking this, and the thing you have to deal with for this to be intelligible to people is that when we talk about the governance of the world, we're not talking about like basically what tends to be popular is to say like, yeah, it looks, what this refers to is that there are, like they're animals and so on. And so we actually, there are simple rules that explain this, and you don't need God in order to explain this. So, like, evolution, for example, therefore the world isn't governed, it's just all completely random. And because of the nature of evolution, it just happens to produce something that looks like it was intended. That tends to be sort of the response, and it's actually rather missing the point. It's not about how do you get some sort of complexity like this. It's not about, evolution is not an answer to the governance of the world. And for the very simple reason that the governance of the world is not really about how did something complex come to be. It's really rather more how did a rational balance come to be maintained. How is it that the rational balance is maintained, that is? And so I'd like to give the example, if you are familiar with science fiction, there's the concept of the gray goo. Tends to refer to nano, like some sort of like nanobot, nanite type things that are programmed to devour raw materials and turn them into more nanobots. And so the gray goo scenario is where these things sort of get loose and they're too good at turning everything into copies of themselves, and so the entire world just becomes this gray goo of nanobots as it destroys everything in its wake. Well, we kind of have those. They're called bacteria, actually. They're really rather a lot like that when you get down to it. And that actually applies at multiple levels, but you can start off just looking at the bacteria. Why isn't there a super bacterium that can defeat everything? Why hasn't evolution produced the bacteria that wins? And so you can see that again at other questions. Like, at no point has there ever been a bacteria that won and just ate absolutely everything, and it is the only thing that exists, and that's the end of it. And you can extend this into lots of other things. There is always this balance between things, and this balance that is maintained. So, for example, there's no such thing as a completely inedible plant that just takes over. There's no such thing as the unstoppable predator who eats 100% of the prey and then, dies of starvation. Nothing ever wins in this sense. And actually, interestingly, you'll see this answer that like, oh, but like things evolve to find a balance because that's when they're best. But that's nonsensical. That's actually not what evolution should produce. Evolution should not, produce a balance. It should produce something that just does better and better and better. And it really should actually, if you think about it, produce a thing that is, like produce a predator that will simply eat all prey, at which point it'll starve to death. But, it should produce that sort of thing because it's not directed to anything. And in every generation, the one that does better, the one that's better at hunting is the one that's selected for. And so it's a really curious thing when you look at it throughout the world that in no circumstance do you have this situation of a winner. You always have that then produces a boring homogeneity where there's no kind of rational relationship or hierarchy for anything. And when you understand it like that what you have is a chaotic system that maintains an unstable balance throughout time, and this unstable balance is vastly more interesting and more complex and has a rational relationship between things, that's where you see governance, because complex systems do not tend to unstable balances. Complex systems tend towards stable things. They tend to degenerate from complex into simple, more stable systems. That's not what you see. And so that is exactly the sign of governance, the sign of something that is maintaining a complex state that things don't tend to and don't naturally tend to. And I mean, if you want to, see an example of this, look at the way that, like, take any animal from anywhere in the world, put it in Florida, and it kills all the native species off. Because, they just tend to be better. So, it's that is, I think, probably, if explained properly, the most intuitive of the arguments, because if you look at the world keeps on working, and it doesn't just all turn into some form of gray goo, like it really should if it was an undirected system. You really should have a winner and losers, not a continual balance. Um, so yeah, that's sort of, I think, my favorite of those arguments, in the sense of what probably is most widely intelligible. Although there is the caveat that you have to sort of uncover some layers of misunderstanding on top of it. Let me see. Kevin Gilchrist asked logical positivism, basically, but I'm not sure what he was talking about, unfortunately. If you could clarify, Cameron. Let me see. Atheism kind of reminds me of homosexuality. They act like they want to be left to their own devices, but inevitably they search for new recruits. El Mao. The yeah, well, it's interesting about atheism and the whole just want to be left alone thing, is that I don't know. Well, I mean, only some of them even say that. Like, some of them are very open about how they want to, like, take over the world and remake it in the atheist image, in different ways. Some of them, the whole, like, then we'll have science and imagine how well we'll do, which is the particularly silly kind. But in general, it is something to bear in mind, though. There are a bunch of atheists that you pretty much never hear from, because they actually just, sort of go about their lives and live in a private way, and don't actually much care. And so you always want to keep in mind selective factors, that the atheists that we're going to see, commenting on YouTube, are the ones who, like, want to talk to other people about it. They're not just randomly selected from the population. So I think that's always important to bear in mind as well. Cameron said, I like Phaser's Aristotelian argument for the existence of God. Yeah, that's the argument from motion or change, which is also the name, also called the argument from contingency and necessity. No, it's not. The argument from change, the argument from, potential and actuality, that potential has to be actualized by something actual, and therefore, no, but it, like, in the moments, like how one moment of time turns into the next, and you need something actual to be actualizing the potential into actuality, and so you have to have something which is purely actual and not itself also potential, or you would have a bunch of dominoes that have never fallen, all falling. And so but not temporally. It would be and this is sort of why it doesn't depend on something like how old the universe is, in the moment, that if nothing turns one moment into the next, then it wouldn't turn one moment into the next. And sort of relatedly, it can't be, kind of obviously can't be one moment that contains the next moment, otherwise they would actually be simultaneous to each other. So yeah, that's the what Phaser calls the Aristotelian argument. And let me see here. And it is a good argument. It's a very, I think, it's a very good argument. St. Thomas actually said it was the most obvious of the arguments, and in some sense I suspect he's right. But on the other hand, it takes a heck of a lot of explaining, I think, in the modern context. And you'll also find a bunch of people trying to deny it, like it's what the whole B theory of time thing is, where they'll argue that there isn't actually actuality and potentiality, there's only actuality. And the funny thing about that B theory of time is that basically it's people who, because the thing is, it's correct from God's perspective. From God's perspective, you don't have moments coming into and out of existence, but all moments exist simultaneously and eternally. From God's perspective, and they exist in God. It's from our perspective, it's from creation's perspective, that we are temporal and one moment exists and other moments don't. So in a sense, what they're doing is they're not wrong when they talk about the B theory of time and say that, like, well, actually things aren't coming, the actualization of potential is not the bringing into existence of anything, because they all exist. In some sense it's right, but it's really weird, because what they're doing is they are admitting the existence of God and trying to use that to get around a proof for the existence of God. They're not doing it, as such, but there's no way to maintain the B theory of time other than to have some pure actuality. in which all of these moments eternally exist. So that's a strange sort of dodge that they try. Let me see. Do you know Adam Friended? He's an atheist who understands the utilitarian nature of Christian morality. Yeah, I've heard the name Adam Friended. I've never seen any of his videos or talked with him. Yeah, the atheists who understand the utilitarian nature of Christian morality are in a very interesting sort of position. That it's really curious because if you think about it from their perspective basically is, for some odd reason, people live better under this lie than under the truth, and it's really weird to be in that position, to think that the optimal strategy is a lie. I'll admit this comes up on occasion. You can occasionally see this. For example, doctors with terminal patients. The idea being that you should always lie to them and tell them they're going to get better, because then basically if you are wrong about it being terminal, then they will fight and live, and if you're not wrong, well, it doesn't really matter. So occasionally you'll see that idea. It's a little bit of a strange one. In a strange sort of situation. It's got to be a very uncomfortable situation to be in, to believe that people need to, that the best way for people to be moral is to live under a lie. Now that said, I saw a really funny video from the one of the Four Horsemen, Daniel Dennett, in which he was actually, if memory serves, he was castigating, I think it was Sam Harris, for proclaiming determinism, and that people won't be morally responsible and act in morally responsible ways if they believe that they're not responsible for their own actions. And so you need to tell them the lie that they have free will so that they will choose to make moral decisions. It's kind of funny. There's no way to state determinism in any sort of coherent way. But yeah, so you will see that from time to time and in different forms. I never quite know what to make of it. And I do also wonder how stable a position it is. Like for example, Nietzscheanism is not stable. Like, people don't tend to stay in Nietzscheanism for long. It's sort of, it involves too much thinking and it's too honest. And so you tend to, if you're a Nietzschean, you tend to either go mad or, well, become Christian. All right, so Scudum Fidela said, Mark, what are your thoughts on angelology? I guess the study of angels. The mystics say that angels move the planets, and even nations have angel dominion. I haven't studied angelology very much. I'm familiar that angels are atemporal created beings, and it's interesting, but it seems to me that the amount we've been given to know about angels is not all that great. The beings of pure spirit with no body is capable of manifesting that. And it was one thing within Christianity, sort of interestingly, the general motif, actually, of creation can be summed up in the idea of in some senses, delegation, the delegation of creation to creation itself, to take part in the act of creation with God. And so an aspect of that is what you see when Christ said that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Or again, in the other part, you can see when Christ said, he who would be first must be last, and he who would be the greatest must be the servant of all. And there is sort of that, within Christianity, that inversion of what people take to be the natural order, that the lesser should serve the greater. And in truth, it really is that the greater serves the lesser, because the greater has more to give. The greater can give to the lesser in a way the lesser can't give to the greater. And so you can see this in, even in things like pet owning. Like a human being can train a dog, but a dog can't train a human being. Not in the same sort of sense. I mean, in some sense they do train us too. But so, you can condescend, that is, con meaning together and descend to come down with. So the actual meaning of condescend, to come down and be with someone. You can do that, but you can't raise yourself up to a higher level on your own. So in a sense, it's the theme of creation. And so, it makes sense that angels who are greater, that is to say, they have much greater intellects than human beings do, are also, given to take care of us, because, anyone who is greater than another is given, in some sense, to take care of them. So it fits in with the theme of it, but I've never studied it in great detail. Let's see. Friend also believes in objective morality, but doesn't seem capable of understanding, has no rational foundation for that belief. Yeah, that kind of gets what I said about them being in a very interesting and possibly not very stable position. I remember there was someone, I don't know if I'm going to remember her name now, Leah Labresco was her name, where she had been an atheist and a fairly vocal atheist. And I remember reading about this. It was a number of years back now, but like the turning point, she was in some argument and said something about, yeah, but morality won't let you. And then, by the description I remember reading, and then paused and said, okay, I realize I just personified morality. And I need to think about whether I really mean that. And then, like, I don't know, a few days, a few weeks later, something like that, she realized, yeah, she did, that morality is a person, and realized that she believed in God. So, yeah, the thing I really wonder about that, because I said I've never met Adam Friended, I've never watched any of his videos, but the thing I always wonder about that sort of atheist is whether it's a stable position. I remember a friend of mine asked me, why aren't there more atheists who take Nietzsche seriously? And I pointed out, well, it's because it's a very unstable position to be in, that you're not going to be an atheist who takes Nietzsche seriously for, 50 years straight. You're going to be that for some number of years, and then you're probably going to become a Christian. And so I kind of think there's something similar there with that style of atheist who really takes objective morality truly seriously, that it's not a stable position, and at some point they're going to discover that it's not a stable position, and they are probably going to side with the truth of objective morality and cease to be atheists. So, yeah, I mean, there are people who can have problems. Nietzsche himself is a curious case because he just seemed to him, the man who killed God was the ugliest man. The death of God was a tragedy for Nietzsche. He just couldn't believe, couldn't believe in God for some reason. It literally drove him insane. At the end of his days, he was dancing naked in his apartment, and called himself Dionysus. And at one point, because his landlord was very kind to him, he wrote a letter in which he said he would have all the anti-Semites shot. His landlord was Jewish, and yeah, and so I mean, Nietzsche ended his days literally insane, and it sort of, and as Chesterton said, it wasn't an accident that Nietzsche ended in insanity. So I think that sort of thing is not a stable position. Let's see. Let's see. Epic Snake. Thank you. Yeah, I love her. See, the logical positivism was a response to something you were saying about materialism. Not sure myself now. Oh, yeah, when I was talking about materialism as just holding that matter and its interactions were all that existed and explained everything. And logical positivism was related to that, historically speaking. I don't know that logical positivism really went much of anywhere. I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, logical positivism was one of those things that was a sort of an outshoot of the same the same sort of drive and push, like had a lot of different expressions. I think logical positivism was just sort of one of them that just then withered off, I believe. I don't think you see much of it, nor many effects from it these days. I think most folks want to live a good life and be left alone. Yeah, it's fairly common. I mean, and a lot of the atheist thing that we see online, I think, is really an attempt by people to form community that they don't find around themselves. At least in my experience, a lot of the atheists that you find tend to come from, not all of them by any means, but tend to come from like small towns that are very heavily Christian, and so they don't fit in there, and so they're trying to find something else and trying to find something else online, and so they sort of latch onto atheism as a as a sort of community building tool, a personal community building tool. So I think we see a bunch of that too, and that explains a bunch of the particulars that we see online. Have you heard of Tumblr House? It's a traditional Catholic podcast channel with Frank. Mancini and Charles Clum. No, I haven't. I'll have to check it out. I thought atheism was becoming blasé in the mainstream, but recently I've been watching a couple of Protestant apologetics channels, and they attract the worst and most cartoonish atheists. Yeah, I mean, it's worth remembering that, the world is never without atheists. I mean, there's a reason why atheos was a Greek word, an ancient Greek word. You'll always find, at least a few atheists, and it's not something the world will ever be completely without. And something like Protestant apologetics channels are pretty much exactly the sort of thing that will attract the worst sort of atheists. So again, it's one of those things to notice. It's non-random samples are really hard to generalize from. It's one reason why too I think it's a lot easier to just have the perspective of just caring about and worrying about the people that you actually meet and trying to help them where possible, however many or few that may be, because it's really, really hard to tell how many or how few that actually is. Okay. I've noticed that atheists tend to go after Protestant channels more, low-hanging fruit. Scoot and Fidela said, I think part of it is yes. Part of it is that the atheists themselves basically are Protestants. I actually like to joke that most of the atheists that we find today are Christian fundamentalists, where they swapped out their holy book. They swapped out the Bible for a science textbook as the holy book that they don't read. And that actually does describe a lot of them. So part of why I think they're really attracted to Protestant apologetics is because they are basically, they are more or less Protestants, that just a slightly different kind of Protestant when you get down to it. So there is a reason for that. There is also the if you're talking about anyone who does the sola scriptura type thing, then you're especially talking about people who a lot of their apologetics tends to be, for lack of a better term, community driven. A lot of their apologetics, if you look at it, will tend to be about, not explicitly, but more or less, here's some stuff that sounds good, for the community. And so that's, I think, part of it too, is since it's less a direct appeal to rational analysis and more, at least, below the text, community driven, the atheists will also be a lot more attracted to that because it's something you can deal with in sort of a different way, and it's merely rejecting it rejects the this is our community, so you need to be this to be a part of our community aspect to the way a lot of that stuff will tend to go. Especially the more you get towards like Christian fundamentalists, the more what I was saying applies. Denon said that we have to pretend that we have free will. Yeah, from Cordy. Yes, that was a funny video. Such a funny video. Because the beautiful thing about it is he's saying that people won't make the right choices unless they believe they have free will. But that could only matter if they were making choices. And that only happens if they have free will. It's such a... Oh, that video was so funny. It's kind of up there with the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science video. If you are one of us, be one of us. I've got a video about that video. Man, was that one funny. Courtney said, I think atheists that accept the value of Christianity are in a position to be open to the argument from desire. Yeah, they might be. Although, I think they also are... they're probably working through something. What you find in a lot of cases is people can take a long time to work through certain ideas, to work through certain things that are problems to them that they may not even be able to articulate. So, the sort of formal argumentation in speech, explaining arguments for the existence of God, explaining a lot of the videos that I have on my channel, like explaining the nature of good and evil, and how evil is a privation, stuff like that, is really, it's not even necessarily planting seeds. It's probably more like removing rocks from the soil so that somebody else can plow it, so that somebody else can plant the seed. And sometimes the exact ordering on that may not be may not always be consistent. So, you know, sometimes there's seeds that are planted, but the seed got underneath a rock, and so you have to pick the rock up so the seed can actually get sunlight and water to germinate and grow. And so, like, it's so often it's not that. Like, it's, you know, often that you give people, you know, these sorts of arguments, these, you know, these sort of videos, conversations that you have or explain things, all that stuff. It's not really that converts a person, but that it gives them the tools to work through the problem that they have, which is very rarely the problem that they describe. It is a very, very rare skill to be able to ask the question you actually want to ask. Takes a tremendous amount of practice and a lot of experience to be able to ask the question you actually want to ask. And so a lot of the times people are asking questions kind of nearby to what they actually want to ask because they don't know what to ask. And in that answer, you eventually give them the tools to figure out that thing that they're actually grappling with. So I think that often happens when when you give that you help people so that they have the tools to work through the stuff they need to work through in order to, you know, get over their problems and, you know, come to belief. Let me see. I look for the day that we begin to ascend to super sapiens. Yeah, you know, that reminds me of something I mentioned to Rob. That one of the real problems that atheists have, they don't use a completely negative definition of atheism as a lack of belief. If they try to use an only partially negative definition. So if you use a completely negative definition, you know, then like this candle is an atheist because, you know, well, it lacks a belief in God so far as we know. And I mean, I have a hard time proving that, but in any event, and so you get this really weird rhetorical position that something like 99.999999999% of atheists are brain dead. And so, you know, statistically, atheism, you know, the average IQ of an atheist is going to be 0.0000000001. Weird rhetorical position to want to be in. But the problem is if you try to qualify this to something like atheism is a lack of belief in a human being, you then, I mean, it's A, obviously arbitrary, but B, you then are entirely open to, okay, so when you claim to be an atheist, this means you're making the positive claim that you're a human being. How do you prove that you're not a genetic mutation into a different species that just happens to look like a human being? And they couldn't prove it. So just the thing about ascending to Super Saiyans, you know, could also be a degeneration too, because, you know, like if they try to say like, you know, lack of belief in something capable of believing in God, well, how do you prove that you're capable of believing in God? Maybe you're a genetic mutation into some sort of, you know, mentally defective version that just lacks the ability to believe in God, kind of analogously to how, an albino is something that lacks the ability, you know, creature that lacks the ability to produce melanin. Maybe you just have a brain defect where you lack the ability to believe in God. How can you prove you can believe in God? And so on. So it just reminds me of that. It's a funny problem because it's a weird rhetorical move that they made. Let me see here. New atheism is kind of the anti-intellectual retread of logical positivism. Yeah. I don't think it had any direct. I think that's, you know, what in biology, when two species happen to look very, very similar, is called convergent evolution. I don't think it's a retread of logical positivism in the sense of they actually read logical positivist works and said like, "Hey, this makes sense. Let's try this again." But yeah, there's a lot of, I believe, if I recall correctly about logical positivism, I believe that to be very correct. In the sense of there are a lot of similar things, just, you know, even more rhetoric and even less thought this time around. The complete dismissal of metaphysics and all that. Yeah, you definitely see that. Isn't mathematics a metaphysical subject in itself? Actually, depends. It depends on things like whether or not you believe numbers exist. The way a lot of mathematics is done today, mathematics is actually purely hypothetical. So like when I was in grad school, I've got a master's degree in math. And so like when I was in grad school, the way proofs would tend to start out is, suppose you have whatever, then, and then you have the conclusion of the the theorem, and then you would show, based upon the assumptions that go into this, what the conclusion is. But there's nothing in any of these theorems that actually say that you have such a thing or that such a thing exists. So it's it's a in that sense, it's not so much metaphysical as simply purely hypothetical. And so you get the really curious thing that you have to make metaphysical claims in order to apply mathematics to anything in the real world. But mathematics in itself is actually so abstract. It's not even that. It's largely purely hypothetical these days. So, but again, it's going to depend on exactly which mathematics you're talking about. So, it varies a little bit. Yeah, but they classify it as a logical part of the logical positivism, the other being strict empiricism. Yeah, I mean, what's funny is there's no such thing as strict empiricism. I mean, even a loose definition of strict empiricism is essentially impractical, and the there isn't really such a thing as strict empiricism, because, like, suppose you measure something, well, you're not measuring it right now, and so you have to go by your memory of it, but what empirical proof do you have that memory is valid? So you can't actually, in any sort of sense, have a genuinely strict empiricism. It's simply not accomplishable. Yeah, so that's the funny thing about anything that claims to be strictly empirical. It isn't. Okay, let's see here. Are you familiar with Paul Vanderklay's channel? His observations on Jordan Peterson brought him to my attention. Really enjoy his videos. Hey, I'm a Protestant, just saying. I haven't seen... one thing, by the way, remember about Protestants is that there's... for one thing, the people are just nominally Protestant. And then another thing is there's a very wide range. Like, High Church Lutherans are really not very Protestant at all in practice, actually. And then you can go all the way to like Christian fundamentalists. So it's something to bear in mind that there are very few generalizations that are actually true about Protestantism. One of them is in practice too, is Protestants very, very rarely believe very much about their, the actual, like, founders of their particular sects. And so, for any given Protestant, how Protestant they actually are is really hard to tell. So generalizations are always painted with an incredibly broad brush. So that's something to bear in mind. I'm not familiar with Vanderklay's channel. It's another one I'll have to check out. Sometimes I think online atheists are cognitively deficient humans. Well, they certainly open them. I mean, that whole lack of belief thing most certainly opens them up to that idea. I mean, it's a really, really simple explanation. Like, I lack a belief in God. Okay, well, maybe you're defective. Maybe you're just incapable of doing it. You've got some sort of brain defect. You've got some sort of mental defect. A person who, lacks the ability to do a high jump, or a person who lacks the ability to walk up the stairs has something wrong with their legs. So, sorry to hear it. It really, rhetorically speaking, it very much opens them up to exactly that. So it's why it's why I don't understand why they take this rhetorical position. It's not rhetorically advantageous. It's incredibly rhetorically disadvantageous. So yeah, I don't. It shocked me when I first saw that anyone would try that. Yeah, I mean, by all means, it's if you're in some sort of in a battle of rhetoric with someone, then it is very much a rhetorical tool to point out that their lack of belief could, very, very easily be explained by a cognitive defect. And since, in general, when people can't do something that most people can do, we call this some sort of defect. Why shouldn't we just attribute this to a cognitive defect on their part? And then, just let them storm off, because they're never going to take that seriously and answer it. But anyway, if you're in a battle of rhetoric, it's really, really easy to win because they put themselves in such a rhetorically bad position. Query said, the way I look at it is that atheism that we know it is in the internet is a metaphysical sickness. Most Christians have some sort of crisis of faith in their teenage years. They just don't grow out of it. Yeah, there is very much that possibility, in certain senses. Um, so I'm sure for some people, at least, that is simply true. There are a lot of different people with a lot of different issues. So again, when you're talking about atheists, it's a very broad brush. Like you could only paint with a very broad brush because there are going to be a lot of differences. And yeah, so it's hard to say. For at least some of them, you do get that sort of thing. But for others, there'll be some particular thing. Like one thing I found is that atheism is, in many ways, it's a sort of mental prison. I've described this before. That you know the atheist worldview sort of does explain everything in one, on its own terms. It sort of explains everything. As Treshkin would say, nothing is worth explaining under it, but it does explain everything in an incredibly simplistic sort of way. It does. And then, on the other hand, the Christian worldview also explains the world on its own terms, and it explains it much bigger and much broader, and much more fully. And what I've pointed out to a number of the more intelligent atheists is they both work. They both explain the world, and really the position that you fall to, because in the one, rationality doesn't work, and so when rationality doesn't work, then the fact that things don't make sense makes perfect sense and is entirely consistent. Whereas on the other hand, in the worldview in which reason works, and reason, it works because the world is grounded. We're made in the image of God, and the world is a rational creature, is created according to a rational idea. Then that also works. And so really what you have to do is figure out which of these two worldviews seem that are consistent and internally consistent and explain the world. Which of these two seems more true? And you're not going to get out of one from within it. You're not going to, from within atheism, think your way out of it on atheist terms. You have to step outside of it to look at the world and try to think, of these possibilities, which of these two seems more to be the world that I find myself in? Does reason work? Is the world a rationally intelligible place, or is it just a chaotic mishmash of everything? Yeah, unfortunately, I have to get going. I've got to get back to taking care of my family. Yeah, just to sort of end on that note, something to very much bear in mind, in what you observe, and there's a wide variety in atheists, but is that it really is in many ways sort of a mental prison that can be very hard to escape from unless you can figure out how to, sort of climb out of that pit and escape from it. And yeah, so it's individuals will vary, but for at least some of them, yeah, it's sort of a thing that they're trapped in. And sometimes some of them want to be atheists, but in which case it's a prison of their own making. And some of them are atheists much more accidentally and not intentionally, and just aren't sure how to get out of it, and need help getting rid of getting rid of things. So, well, anyway, thanks for everyone who showed up, and thanks. It was fun. It was good talking with you guys. God bless everybody, and till next time, may you hit everything you aim at.